fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 29, Lose Sight. Calculating the average speed of a river this size, approximately 20.76 feet per second, and combining it with his current walking speed of 4.31 miles per hour, that meant his chances of slipping were a staggering 16.48% for every 5 minutes spent crossing unreliable terrain. Eric scratched at his beard with the ferocity of a dog itching at a flea. His subconscious spun with numbers and equations, like a manic voice in the back of his head. Wherever he glanced, there weren't objects in his path, but variables to be accounted for. And it was all too much. It overloaded his mind and threatened to spiral him towards a mental break. He knew this feeling, as it nearly caused him to drop out of college the last time it had happened. If he could hold out a little longer, he knew that every problem had a solution, and every miscalculation could be corrected. His foot slipped as a portion of toppled brick wall crumbled beneath his weight, and Eric let out a high-pitched scream. Angle of incline was 86 degrees, and the moment of impact was less than half a second. His chances of not falling into the water were... A strong hand snapped tight around the back of Eric's shirt, and he was saved from an icy bath, as tragedy hauled him back up to the makeshift path.
"You scream like a little girl."
Theodore relaxed his fingers, and then threatened the doctor with a pointed gesture.
"Watch where you're walking. I ain't jumping in after you, so slow down. You're acting like this is a race."
Steadying himself with a sharp intake of breath, Eric gingerly returned his weight to his injured calf and began scaling his way up and across the toppled building. The plan was to aim for a pile of wood trapped by the current between this island and the next, formed by a mass of shattered concrete. He stared at all the wreckage pointing out from the water, a dark reminder of what had happened to the first world he had forced onto this one.
No. We gotta move faster.
Much faster than this. Theodore could only roll his eyes as he readjusted the limp figure slung over his shoulder. He turned, scanning the edge of the twilight city behind them. They were a good distance across the river now, but still in danger's reach if they had been spotted. After scouting the routes, he made sure theirs had plenty of cover. A blessing and a curse, however, as that meant it was more difficult to traverse than other paths. If they could hold out for just a bit longer, they would have the night on their side. Of course, that would present them with the task of navigating a death-trap bridge over a raging river in the dark. But beggars can't be choosers. Crack! His first instinct was that something had shifted in the rubble and they were about to all be plunged into the water, but another crack rang out as something impacted the concrete next to him, followed closely by a blast of gunpowder.
"Get down!"
He scooped Eric up with one arm, snatched Varen with the other, crushing him next to his brother, and took a running leap over the water to the next island. Theodore hit the concrete and slid down into a defensible position. Above their heads, the rain of lead increased as more and more soldiers poured in. If they couldn't move, and quickly, it wouldn't be long before they were completely overrun. But with every break in the gunfire, another spray of bullets would pepper the slab behind them, signaling a coordinated attack. Theodore grunted. If he couldn't figure out an escape plan, their concrete shield would quickly become Swiss cheese. Wincing once more at the pain in his leg, Eric reached over towards the king, but the prince blocked his efforts. He growled, attempting to shove the man out of the way.
"If you want to survive this..."
He couldn't dislodge Varen. His attempts to shield his brother were too strong.
"We need to force Rivaria out."
He tried to snake his arm past the prince, but it was slapped out of the way.
"I know I sound like a broken record, but I can't even quantify the number of lives that are at stake here."
He searched those familiar green eyes.
"Please!"
Herron shook his head, refusing another attempt to grab his brother, and tapped the back of one fist to the top of the other, pulling them apart before pointing at Elias.
I don't know what you're saying.
Eric released his grip on the man.
We don't have time for this. It's... Oh my God.
Theodore had reached his tolerance threshold and threw out a hand to clamp it tight around the doctor's mouth, who attempted to finish his conversation against his palm.
You talk way too much. Just sit here, and the three of you be ready to move when I say.
Eric licked his lips, grimacing at the dusty taste he found there when tragedy pulled away and stood. His face fell into disbelief as he watched the fabric of his clothes tear where the bullets attempted to pierce the skin beneath. This man was now impervious to gunfire?
What the hell?
There were about 10 men standing on the shore, with another 3 making their way towards them. The bullets continued to ricochet off Theodore's skin. Most of them he barely registered, but several that hit had more impact. Okay, so multiple calibers. Avis-style flintlock rifles, but also something else with a bit more kick. Better to get a move on now than before they brought out something that could bring him down. He bent, slamming his fingers beneath a large slab of concrete half submerged in the water. It was mostly held together by thick rebar, and he hoisted it upright with a strained groan. Glancing over his shoulder, Theodore was met with the stunned faces of the doctor and the prince, their jaws agape in awe. He growled,
Go! Try to keep me between you and them as best you can.
There was a scurry to comply, and Theodore repositioned himself, peering out through one of the cracks. A week ago, he wouldn't have been able to lift anything even a quarter of this size. He smirked at the irony that the thing that was killing him was also saving their lives. Eric helped the prince pull Elias from the ground, but was met with immediate regret. Pain shot through his calf, and he let go of the king like he was a white-hot iron.
Yeah. You're gonna have to shoulder him. I can't support his weight, what with my injured leg.
He probably could have pushed through the agony, but he was still salty about having been shot. That, and he couldn't afford to slow down. Cursing inwardly, Herron watched the coward bolt ahead, leaving him and his brother behind. He positioned his shoulder firmly under Elias's arm and began to half-drag the stumbling man away from the gunfire. He tensed as his right foot slid several inches, dropping his one leg into the river up to his knee. The path was treacherous, not just with slippery stones, but also with the clogging debris or large metal bars that stuck out of almost every slab. A task already dangerous enough. But his brother, mumbling to himself, struggling to reach for the water, made it all the more difficult. Herron shifted the king around, shaking his head at the man in an attempt to settle him down. Oh, what he wouldn't give to be able to speak right now. Theodore continued to watch through the crack as more and more soldiers piled in on the shoreline, many venturing out towards them. He had hoped his efforts of destroying several communications towers would have slowed their response times, but apparently his luck didn't hold out for that. He chanced a peek over his shoulder to see the doctor was nearly to the shore, but the prince was lagging, struggling with the king. He growled when he returned his attention to the crack in the stone slab. The front line of soldiers were going to reach them before they made it across. 3 of the monks were close enough now that he could make out the golden sigils around their necks. Just a moment longer, and... Straining every muscle in his body to their limits, Theodore cried out as he shoved the makeshift wall with all the strength he could muster. It traveled through the air much further than he would have thought, and impacted the rubble bridge with a deafening blast. The man closest was reduced to a smear as the slab shattered, smashing into the unstable island like a shower of meteors. The platform crumbled, washing everything, including those monks still on the bridge, downriver. But that didn't stop the swarm of ants, only slowed them. As more Brotherhood monks mixed with the Avis soldiers, Theodore bent, scooping up a boulder roughly half his size, and lobbed it. The swarm scattered, one of them losing their footing and being swept away by the rage of the river. He grinned as they halted their advances and turned to defense, retreating to cover and leveling their weapons instead. On the far side of the river, Eric made the final leap from an overturned cart to solid ground. In a moment of odd nostalgia, standing on muddy cobblestone roads, he realized they weren't far from where Elias had tried to find the Queen that first day. It was just over a week ago, but it felt like months. He spun, noticing this portion of Avis had been abandoned. It was just the edge of the city, cut off from the main metropolis. He wagered the inhabitants had been relocated to be closer to the heart of the city and its resources. Distant gunshots drew Eric's attention back the way he had come. Maximum range of early model flintlock rifles, approximately 175 yards, accurate to only 100 yards. He shook the intrusive factoids from his mind and could see Varen and Elias heading his way, while tragedy fended off another spray of bullets with a hunk of twisted metal for a shield and forged bricks for weapons.
Ooh, ouch. That'll leave a mark.
Eric winced as he watched one of the red blocks hit home, knocking a Brotherhood soldier clean off his feet. But he was wasting time standing here waiting for them. Precious time. He needed to get to the tower. He was about to turn when something firm grabbed him by the back of the shirt.
Die, heretic!
Eric's blood ran cold as he looked back at his attacker. The robed man was raising a knife in his direction. In a moment of blind panic, he spun and threw his arms up to shield himself. The blade bit painfully into his skin, but had been prevented from hitting anything vital. The two stumbled across the slick stones, and Eric's injured leg screamed beneath him. He was sent to his knees, crying out in pain as he hit the street. The guard caught his footing and reached for him again. Eric slapped away the hand, rolling over as the soldier jumped atop him. The weight was too much, and it sent the two of them sliding down the muddy embankment. The two struggled with one another, despite how close they were to the river, before he managed to knock the knife from the monk's hands and it splashed out of sight. Enraged, the Brotherhood soldier spat out a series of curses, fighting through the struggling hands to place either of his on the heretic's neck. He began to press his thumbs against the throat, constricting around it like a vice.
"O enlightened one, may this heathen quake in fear!"
The monk's words faded as mathematical vectors on how he was dying invaded Eric's mind. Despite his struggles, or how hard he slapped, he couldn't dislodge the soldier, and the memory of Alistair doing the same thing to him came rushing back as lights popped in his vision. But unlike that moment, there was no faithful zombie to save him this time. There was a brief moment, perhaps due to the lack of oxygen in his brain, where Eric found his nerves calmed and his mind clear. He was a doctor, after all, and as such, he knew the weakest points in the body. He thrust his hands up, digging a thumb into each of the monk's eye sockets. There was a cry of pain, and the pressure on his neck vanished. Eric sucked in deep gulps of wet air as he blinked away the dizzying rush to his vision. He struggled to crawl back up the embankment, his fingers pulling in handfuls of mud and grass, but the soldier refused to give up. He was hauled back down, landing atop the monk, and the two of them toppled into the river. The current attempted to pull them in deeper, but Eric had found something to hold on to. A chunk of rubble stuck out of the mud near the broken path, and he wrapped a hand around a length of twisted metal. He pulled himself above the water, sucking in another gulp of air. But the monk, blind, refused to relinquish his hold on him and threatened to drag them both to their deaths. The fight for his life overtook his rational mind, and Eric reached behind him, grabbing the soldier by his hair. Then he began to force him beneath the surface, one hand still clutching his lifeline. There was a great deal of kicking and splashing, hands clawing at his arm, but he held firm. He pushed away that gnawing sensation of guilt in his gut as he continued to keep the monk submerged. The minutes ticked away as slowly as years, until, Finally, the struggling stopped, and the man fell limp. Eric released the body and let the river take it before pulling himself out of the water. His own breathing labored. He let the realization of what he had just done wash over him. He choked back the tears to remind himself that there were more important things at hand to worry about. Like everything else, this act would be washed away as soon as he reset events. With that rallying feeling, he climbed to his feet, shakily. Blood was dripping from the cut in his forearm and oozing from the bandage on his leg, but he ignored the pain and looked up to see the prince standing on solid ground with the king still slung over one shoulder, staring at him with abject terror in those green eyes. Eric stumbled back up the muddy embankment and across the cobblestones. It didn't matter. None of this would matter, but he needed to survive. They had to outlast the onslaught of the Brotherhood's advances in order for him to see his plan to fruition. There were soldiers advancing from the city, as well as ones from stations on this side of the river. The time for half measures was over. He turned his frustration on the prince.
I'm tired of asking.
He moved closer as Varen began backpedaling away from him.
I'm tired of you all looking at me like I'm the villain.
He pointed across the river.
That isn't even our biggest problem right now, but they will keep me from doing what I have to do to save the lives of countless people.
The last thing Wilfred had said to him floated along Eric's ears, sending chills throughout. Countless lives. Perhaps more than even the old man had realized. Varen shook his head, lifting his hands to respond, but was cut off by the hateful sneer in the doctor's words.
I wasn't asking.
Eric took another step, but turned his gaze on Elias. This was either a dumb idea or the most brilliant one he had had in an age.
I've heard tales of this mighty goddess Ravaria, but look at you, shackled in this worthless bag of bones.
The king's head lolled in his direction, his eyes struggling to focus on anything. Eric took a shaky breath and barreled on.
This vendetta you wished to settle with the Brotherhood led you to being shot out of the sky the moment you found them. Then they immediately walloped you so hard, I'm not even sure you're still in there.
The wandering gaze locked with his.
I guess if I wanted something done, I should have put my faith in the scholar.
A flash of purple ignited behind Elias's eyes. Something burned through Varen's veins that he couldn't place. Anger? Fear? No, it was something greater. And it was driving him to protect his family. He would not let Eric pull his brother back down that path, to allow the goddess of night to take his sibling from him. Energy coursed up his body like frosted lightning, from one arm to the other and filling his lungs with air. It erupted from him with a shock and an ear-shattering, "I said no!" He didn't recall shoving the doctor back, but he had. Hard enough that Eric rolled when he hit the ground. There was a stunned silence that hung heavy in the air around them, and the seconds ticked by as Varen simply stared down at his own hand. Those words came from his throat, the first he had said in half a century. By the time Eric managed to pry open his eyes, pain coursing through his entire body, he could see the prince was already gone. He struggled to wrap his mind around what just happened when footsteps crunched up behind him and he twisted, wincing at the motion. He relaxed, however, to see it was only tragedy.
What happened? Where's Elias?
Eric glowered, nodding his head in the direction the prince had fled.
Herron grew a spine. Bloody hell.
Theodore pinched the bridge of his nose.
I'll go get him. No!
Eric struggled, forcing himself onto his hands and knees.
Get me to the tower. There are soldiers on this side, and I can't make it past them on my own. I don't work for you. The man you work for is dead.
Eric looked up to meet Tragedy's gaze.
You want to save your sister? Get me inside that tower.
He struggled to his feet, collapsing against the bodyguard with a wobble.
Then you can do whatever you want. Try and rescue Elias. Adopt a dog, or start a family. I don't care. Just help me first. I can save us all.
His face faltered, worry and horror breaking past his mask of disdain.
Please.
Piper had desired one thing ever since that airship had crashed. A nice, long bath followed by a hot meal. But plunging face first into the frigid river was not the reprieve she had been hoping for. They had scoured the shoreline for the safest passage to the other side, and settled on one that, according to her brother, was the sturdiest of the bunch. Wooden planks had been lashed together with rope and supported between chunks of large debris from the floating city. The muddy prints on it told them it was sturdy enough to support a small brigade of slow-moving people. But, however finely crafted this bridge had been made, it wasn't done so with the notion of supporting the weight of a massive, full-grown bear with 3.5 humans on its back. Thankfully, it had held out long enough to see them safely across 3/4 of the river before it gave up, and their plunge into the icy river hadn't been as dangerous.
You know, I always thought bears could swim.
Atticus let out a small cough as he pulled his sopping hat from his head and twisted it, wringing out the excess water.
I guess all my books were wrong.
Barry grunted indignantly from the bank, where he was still trying to haul himself up. Rolling his eyes, Evan shook his head.
He says he's a great swimmer. He just had a cramp in his elbow.
Feeling an uncomfortable wriggle, he grabbed hold of the zipper of his coat and pulled. More water, and a nice-sized trout splashed free. He nudged it back into the river and watched it swim away before he looked back at the lumbering beast.
That, and Barry isn't really a bear.
With a plop, Barry finally managed to pull himself onto the cobblestone shore. Sopping wet, his impressive size was diminished, and now he resembled a gigantic, still terrifying, wet dog, or maybe a meat-eating horse. Evan reached over and patted the beast on the nearest paw.
It's all right, buddy. You did your best.
He looked over his shoulder, a half-smile cocking on his face.
At least you could swim better than that wolf.
Winter, struggling to catch his breath, lay on his back in a puddle of mud, staring up at the winking stars in the sky.
That was horrible.
I also didn't know wolves were afraid of water. Atticus put his wet hat back on his head. Piper put her hands up.
Look, we can poke and prod at each other later.
She spun on her heel, taking in her surroundings.
I don't see the prince anywhere.
They were on the far side of the river, but Ava's houses still dotted the landscape between the trees and rocks of what looked to be a forest at one point. She glanced over at the bear.
Are you sure we're in the right place?
Barry's shake of his head turned into a whole-body shudder, pelting them all with a spray of river water. His body much lighter now, he sat back on his haunches, and he shoved his large snout into the air.
Oh, God.
Winter rolled away from the deluge.
It got in my mouth.
He gagged.
When's the last time you took a bath? Ugh. It tasted like roadkill served on top of an old car battery.
Ignoring the jab, Barry sucked in a deep breath through his nose, letting it fill his lungs. He could faintly detect the smell on the breeze. He landed back on all fours and pointed off towards the south with one large paw. From across the river, the city lights of Avis began to click on, the warm glow not quite reaching across the expanse of the river. The structures on their current side had been severed from their electric connection, leaving them alone in the darkness. Piper squinted at her traveling companions.
Do any of you have a torch? Oh, Unit 2 has several.
Atticus's voice trailed off as he looked to his right, expecting to see his best friend there, like he always had been, but instead was greeted by that massive profile of a bear. He cast his eyes down with a sigh.
I wish we could have stopped by my shop to check.
Piper put her hand on her brother's shoulder.
It's all right, buddy. It's more important to find Herron first.
She was still sold on the notion that the machine was nothing more than a twisted hunk of metal underneath that rubble, but she kept that to herself.
Besides, I don't think Unit 2 would be much of a swimmer. He's probably safer being left behind. But the prince, he could be in trouble.
He wanted to protest. He wouldn't feel right until he knew for sure, but Atticus relented at the barely visible smile he could make out on his sister's face.
Okay. Well then, can we go look after we find Herron?
Of course! She caught Evan giving her a look. She didn't like lying to her brother either, but one problem at a time. She turned on the spot, squinting at the others.
But we'll never be able to say anything out here if we don't have a torch.
Winter grinned to himself, fumbling around in the grass.
You know, I used to be in a scouting program back home when I was 9.
He managed to find 2 rocks that fit nicely in his palm. They had the right, glassy look of quartz that he needed.
I can still remember those nights spent round the campfire, enjoying my vegan s'mores.
Next, he took hold of what he thought was a branch sticking out of a shrub at the base of one of the homes, but it turned out to be an abandoned broom. He smiled at it.
I might not be good for much, on the count that I'm a pacifist and definitely not a fighter, but that don't mean I can't be helpful from time to time.
He smacked the stones together, over and over, until sparks began to fly. They fizzled before catching on anything, but he continued.
You see, the trick is getting the right angle.
He tried again.
Of course, he was using cotton balls dipped in lighter fluid, but the idea is the same.
Evan rubbed at his forehead, the clack, clack, clack of stones grating on his nerves. But the lichen had given him an idea. He began to tap around the sopping pockets of his jacket until he found something he had almost forgotten he had. His well-loved and heavily dented metal lighter. He was about to offer it up when the bristles of the broom began to glow with the beginnings of a flame.
Hey, it actually worked.
He sheepishly pocketed his lighter.
You bet it did. Earned the merit badge and everything.
Grinning, Winter blew on the smoldering embers until a fire sparked to life. He stood, holding out the torch as his smile grew wider.
This won't last long. We'll need to keep finding other things to light off it.
He offered it over to the girl.
I'll look for more branches as we go. We should get moving.
Piper took the broom, her mouth twitching into an impressed smile.
All right, man bun. Way to go.
She spun on the spot, holding her new torch up high to spread the light. That orange glow fell across a mixed path of mud and stones, and she started across it. The abandoned portion of the city had looked innocent, if depressing, during the day, but now, with the flickering light reaching up against the long shadows, and the deathly silence save for the rushing water and crackle of the torch, it set all of them on edge. A flash of movement caught her attention. Piper turned, waving the broom towards one of the remaining houses. This one, like the others, was dark and leaning heavily to one side. But a lumpy, disfigured shape lumbered out from behind it, and Piper let out a scream. It was wide, with two heads, walking with an odd, limping gait. She brandished the torch like a sword, warding off the creature. "Oi! Back off, ugly!" Her words fell away as Varen shuffled into the spilling light. The grotesque figure turned out to be Elias slumped against the prince's shoulder, his wandering eyes gazing at nothing. She was ready to hug the man, despite his hold on the High Inquisitor, when the bear at her side began to emit a low, terrifying growl. "Will you please slow down?" Pyra winced with each step, her sore feet crying out in agony as she struggled to keep up with the cyborg. Even with the sun nearly gone, she had never seen so many people, and the man's red coat kept disappearing out of sight.
"There's no time!"
Vel stumbled as he pushed through a group of civilians that had poked out to see the commotion. He hit the ground hard and rolled a few paces, pain rippling through his body. He took a moment to catch his breath before he pushed himself to his hands and knees. His body still felt like it was made of lead, but he couldn't stop now. "Your Majesty," Undine jogged beside the Queen, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We should return to Bashinol at once. If the scholar is here—" Pyra shouldered off the Dryad's concerns. Not because it was misplaced, but because something else was happening that pulled her attention away. As the sun finished its descent behind the mountains, light began to flood the streets. Curious posts flared to life with flameless candles every dozen feet. The windows in the homes had also illuminated with light, and soon the city was twinkling around them in the darkness. In this moment of terror and panic, it stunned her to find such beauty in her surroundings. "Is this another fire spell? I thought you didn't have magic." Pyra reached her hand up to the nearest lamppost, her fingers hesitating before she touched the glass that surrounded the light. Vel climbed the rest of the way to his feet and grunted, dusting off his clothes. He turned to see the Queen's face filled with wonder, and it pulled at his heartstrings. He wasn't sure if it was the way the orange glow illuminated off her copper skin or the glitter of excitement in those golden eyes, but a crooked smile wormed its way across his face. Something welled inside him, but he shoved it down. Now was not the time to reminisce on old memories. He cleared his head with a shake.
"No, it's not a spell. But when all this is said and done, I'll give you a tour of the city."
Vel wiped the tiny smile away with the sleeve of his coat as he turned his sights back on the looming shape in the darkness. The tower. According to Pyra, that was where Elias held this mystical artifact that had rent the world, and where Eric had helped him do it. If they were headed there, so too were the kids. He jolted back into a run, weaving in and out of the crowds of onlookers. It didn't take them long to find the edge of the city path, where the river carved Avis in two. Vel could hear the continued shouts of the Prime Minister, desperate to get his attention, but he ignored the man and scanned the obstacles in the water. The fallen chunks of debris created natural paths, while others had been tethered to one another to create treacherous, makeshift bridges. Without Amy's guidance, he would have to pick one and hope for the best. The one to his left looked like it had suffered a bomb attack halfway across, a large section washed away downstream. The one to his right had broken free from its tethers and was now rolling atop the waves. That left him with one that twisted and curled in on itself, branching off into separate paths that snaked along the natural curves of the river. He stumbled across the first set of slabs, his foot sliding clean off it and into the chilly water. He clambered across a downed support beam, and then onto the collapsed roof of a house. By the time he had reached the first large island formed of the concrete plate, wading through the waist-deep water that sloshed over it, Vel realized this task would not be as easy as previously thought. If he was wrong, and the kids weren't over there, then he'd be risking his life for nothing. He was clutching a jagged pole of rebar, half his body submerged in water. It was only 7 days ago that he was standing on a hunk of rock, much like this one, holding on for dear life as the world he knew came shattering down beneath his feet. In the darkness of the far shore, a flicker of a flame was birthed into being. Vel squinted to see the familiar floppy hat of a dark-skinned boy and the blonde mop of hair from his sister.
Piper! Atticus!
He pulled one hand free to cup around his mouth, but was nearly swept downriver. He called out again, but he was simply too far for his words to be heard over the rushing of the water. He struggled to pull himself up, climbing at last onto the flat surface of the next stone slab. His wet coat clung to him, suffocating him with its weight, but he took the next step carefully, watching his feet with every movement. But when Vel looked back up, he saw something that chilled him to his core. Some monstrous beast had lumbered into the firelight. It looked like a shaggy, wet dog the size of a horse, with a mouth full of angry teeth. And there, just on the other side of the kids, he could make out a familiar figure with a shock of white hair near his temples. Elias. That tingling feeling in his fingers and toes was quickly replaced by a rage-fueled panic. Blood was rushing in his ears now, and Vel could hardly hear the sound of Pyra speaking to him. He didn't even give himself a moment to be shocked by the fact that she was standing on open water like it was nothing more than a muddy street. The kids were in danger, and he had a horrible idea. We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded.
Children, please, hey, untie Ricky from that tree.
Oh, that's not good.
Oh, man, who put the zip line right next to the latrine? Scouts are supposed to be cleanly.
Fireball!
Dang it, Carl. I told you to keep Johnny away from the lighter fluid. Damn, this is the last time I want to... You know what? Hey, anybody who wants s'mores?
That's me!
All right. Anybody who wants s'mores has to sit by the fire and behave. Good. All right. Everybody gets one.
Troop Master Pinkston?
Yes, Winner?
Are these s'mores vegan? Because I can't have animal byproducts.
I mean, it's just a crud ton of sugar. I'm pretty sure it'll be fine.
My mommy says marshmallows have gelatin in them, and I can't have gelatin. You can share mine. My dad says these ones are keto-friendly. That's even worse. Do graham crackers have gluten? Can I put Skittles on mine?
Enough. All right. Everybody else can have a s'more. And Winner, I think I have a carrot in my camping gear.
Ooh, yummy! Is it organic?